Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Shannon Blankenship. I am the Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Jimmy Orth, Executive Director.
Hello.
Today we're discussing wetlands, beyond just absorption and filtration, but the role that they play in our capacity to mitigate and adapt to climate change and rising waters. Dr. Lisa Chambers, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Central Florida, is joining us to share some of her research and expertise in wetlands and carbon storage. Today we're going to cover the role that wetlands play in the St. Johns River watershed, how wetlands and wetland soil cycle store carbon with our guest speaker, and then we're going to end with viewer comments and questions. So definitely everyone stick around for that. But to begin, we're going to talk a little bit about the St. Johns River watershed. And Jimmy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate it. It's going to be a great topic. Before we get started, for those of you not familiar with St. John's Riverkeeper, just wanted to give you a little bit of information about us and what we do. We are a nonprofit advocacy group for the St. John's River, and that includes the entire watershed. About 900 miles, extends from just west of Vero Beach all the way up to the Atlantic Ocean at Mayport. It's 310 miles long, and so we technically represent this whole geographic area. Our work is really to be an advocate for the river, for policies that are going to protect the river, making sure that those policies are enforced and implemented. Holding polluters accountable, and also working with our regulatory agencies to make sure they're fulfilling their responsibilities and jobs. We also have an outstanding outreach and education team and do a lot with raising awareness about issues that impact the St. John's, and also educating in the school system. We have been involved in schools in Duval County, Putnam County, Volusia County, and others, and really trying to educate the next generation of advocates for the St. Johns River. And we do a lot of outreach programs also for adults as well, to engage people and get them involved in this advocacy work as well.
So Jimmy, chime in at all if I start to break up, and feel free to take over. But before we get started, I wanted to give a quick background on, why wetlands are such a priority for St. John's Riverkeeper. So St. John's Riverkeeper, we work to protect the entire St. John's River watershed. It includes the tributaries and the wetlands that are all hydrologically connected to the river system. Now, to be effective at protecting the river, we have to make sure that we protect the wetlands too. They serve as filters for runoff. They provide critical flood storage. They slowly replenish and release water back into our aquifer and our waterways. Instead of sending floodwaters into the river, they're going to hold that water and capture it, releasing it slowly, protecting our communities. Wetlands are home to endemic species and rare species, species that can only survive in the lands that are either seasonally or partially wet sometimes of the year. The grasses that live in wetlands are critical for retaining sediment, capturing it, keeping it in place rather than letting it wash away and go downstream. Policies to protect wetlands have always been high on our list at St. John's Riverkeeper of advocacy priorities. However, we know that regardless of that, we continue to lose wetlands. We're losing acreage to development each year. And as wetlands are lost, or sometimes wetlands become smaller, or they become fragmented and broken up, they eventually lose their capacity to provide those ecosystem services that are so important to the river. Today, we're focusing on one very specific benefit of wetlands, carbon storage, and the role that wetlands play in climate change mitigation, possibly adaptation. And I'm going to introduce now our speaker, Dr. Lisa Chambers is an associate professor in the biology department and National Center for Integrated Coastal Research, as well as the principal investigator of the Aquatic Biogeochemistry Lab at the University of Central Florida. Her research focuses on the impacts of disturbances like sea level rise, climate change, and urbanization on the wetland and coastal ecosystem functions, including nutrient cycling. Dr. Chambers holds a PhD in soil and water science from the University of Florida and a master's, a little bit of background noise, in oceanography and coastal sciences from Louisiana State. I'm gonna mute myself now so there's not so much background noise. Dr. Chambers, I wanna thank you so much for joining us today and ask you to kick us off by helping us to understand wetlands. What differentiates a wetland from other kinds of land uses?
All right, thank you, Shannon, for such a great introduction, and thank you all for coming and inviting me to speak here today. It's a real honor to be part of the St. John's Riverkeeper. So talking about wetlands, you know, Shannon did a great job explaining a lot of the benefits of wetlands, and they're really numerous. You know, they're considered the kidneys of our landscape. They're so good at filtering and processing nutrients and different things like that. But one of the things that wetlands do that a lot of people don't think about as much is store carbon. And this is really the topic of my research program. And specifically, the way that wetlands store so much carbon is that they're able to have very high rates of primary production. In other words, plant growth. Now, wetlands in particular, you know, we define them in the landscape. As the layperson, we can see these areas. They're the marshes, the bogs, the swampy, wet areas. From a scientific standpoint, we define wetlands by three characteristics: the presence of water, which is easy, right? They're wetlands. The presence of plants that are adapted to those wet conditions. And then the presence of unique soils that are able to oftentimes accumulate in these wet conditions. In particular, here in Florida, we have a lot of peat soils. So peat is something a lot of you are probably familiar with. When you start a garden and you go and buy flower bed mix from the local hardware store, it's very similar to wetland peat. It's this super rich, dark organic matter. And all of that material is actually dead plants that have slowly degraded over time and been preserved. And it turns out that wetlands are really good at doing this because they're so wet. We have CO2 in the atmosphere coming in, plants are taking it up and producing biomass, they die, and in these wet environments, the end of that cycle, the microbial decomposition of that plant material doesn't happen, or it happens very, very slowly, because just like us, those microbes want to breathe oxygen, right? They want to consume oxygen, and there's just no oxygen available in the water. And so what happens is all of that organic matter starts to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, and it makes wetlands into these enormous carbon sinks. And this image that Shannon put up for us is a great example of this. So when we think about climate and we think about carbon, a lot of people automatically think about the atmosphere. We hear so much about increasing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere and how this is driving climate change. But in reality, if we look at what we consider the fast carbon pools on Earth, so this is carbon that cycles within the period of a single person's life, kind of the actively moving carbon. Almost half of it is actually stored within our soils. And as you can see here, atmosphere only makes up about 17% of that active carbon pool. And then Shannon, if you can click one more time, the thing that's really amazing about this is that wetlands, they only make up about 6% of our terrestrial land surface, yet they store and hold about 16% of all of the actively cycled carbon on Earth. And this is because of that kind of characteristic, very slow decomposition, preservation of all of that plant biomass in the soil. And you can see that here in some of these images. These are pictures of deep peat soil cores that we've pulled out of wetlands here on UCF. And it's just this great dark organic matter that contains tons and tons of carbon. Usually organic matter is about 50% just pure carbon. And so this is a great mechanism by preserving wetlands, by promoting wetlands and keeping them wet. It's a great way to actually help mitigate climate change. And in the process of doing so, we can slow down processes like sea level rise that we're experiencing in the St. Johns River.
You know, I think this is fascinating, Dr. Chambers, because, you know, for one, at St. John's Riverkeeper, I've been working for St. John's Riverkeeper for 16 years. And literally over that period of time, I can't tell you how many times I've mentioned the words wetlands and how important they are. But never up until recently did we realize that there was this additional benefit, which is just unbelievable. Also, I was struck too by, we always talk about, there's been a lot of talk, of course, about saving forests, planting trees as a great way to sequester and store carbon. And yet I read something on the NOAA website that I thought was fascinating. I'm sure you found in your research as well, is that coastal wetlands sequester carbon at a rate 10 times greater than mature tropical forests, which I thought was amazing. And so what we've always known is wetlands are pretty special, but it's certainly even more so now after we learn about this type of benefit they're providing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that, a lot of people focus on forests and this idea that forests and trees promote so much biomass, and that's a storage of carbon, and it's true. But what you have to think about is in these terrestrial systems, trees only live for so long, right? 50 years, 100 years, couple hundred years, they die, they fall to the forest floor, and then bacteria just completely decomposes it and sends it back to the atmosphere. So it's a very temporary store. What's unique about wetlands is that biomass falls to the soil surface. In this case, it's covered with water, and it doesn't decompose. And so it just accumulates and accumulates and accumulates over time. And so we see wetlands as not only having more carbon, but it's a more stable form of carbon. Usually once it enters the soil pool, assuming there's no major changes in oxygen availability, it stays there for thousands and thousands of years.
That's a good segue, Dr. Chambers. What happens to wetlands as our sea levels rise? And I know that wetlands aren't all coastal, many are, but there are many inland as well. So what's going on with wetlands as we see sea level rise throughout the state of Florida and all over the world?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that can happen to wetlands. And if you can pull up that other slide that I sent you, let's go to the one after that. Okay. So when we think about sea level rise in wetlands, we typically think about it as kind of three different potential fates of wetlands. We're very much concerned about how wetlands respond to sea level rise because, especially here in Florida, they occupy a vast area of kind of this low-lying coastline. And, you know, in addition to all those services you mentioned, they filter our water, they dampen our storms. There's a lot of research showing how the physical structure of a wetland can reduce storm surges and things like that. So they're doing all of these great services, and it's really important to make sure that as sea level rises that we're able to maintain these ecosystems and kind of the aerial coverage of them. So some of the things that wetlands do is they are exposed to sea level. This first image you can see here, this is actually an aerial image that I took. I got to fly in a helicopter over the Everglades, which was one of the coolest experiences of my life. But it's a great example. You can see here how these different patterns and types of vegetation exist in these kind of horizontal patterns along the coastline. And the reason is that within coastal wetlands, there's these really intense gradients of inundation level and salinity, right? And so there's only certain plant communities that are adapted to each combination of salinity and inundation level, which is why we see these zones. And so one of the things that can happen to wetlands as they're exposed to rising seas is that if you have a coastline that's not very disturbed, it's in a pretty natural state, assuming the sea level is rising fairly slowly, what we see is that these communities simply just kind of migrate upstream or migrate landward to kind of maintain that optimal elevation relative to the tides coming in. And we've seen this all across Florida, you know, very extensive areas of the Everglades, we see these different communities. The salt marsh moves in and replaces the brackish marsh. The brackish marsh moves in and replaces the freshwater marsh. And this works really well, assuming that there's no condo complex sitting there next to it. You know, there's no road or anything like that. And also assuming that there's plenty of seeds. So as you can imagine from a biological standpoint, we're seeing a shift in different species composition. So landward migration is something that has been noted, and there's some really cool studies where they can use like satellites and aerial imagery to show how the communities have moved over time. And in this type of scenario, you know, maybe you're losing a little bit of the upland community on the upland end, but for the most part, the ecosystem and the areas that they cover are staying intact, which is good for the ecosystem services that they provide. So that's kind of the first potential possibility. The second one that I have listed here as number 2 is vertical accretion. And this is one that other people don't maybe think of as much, but it goes back to that idea of the fact that wetlands are able to accumulate that organic matter in the soil. And so they literally build it up over time. I mean, their elevation actually increases over time as it builds up this organic matter. And so this process called vertical accretion is a natural feedback mechanism to sea level rise. What happens is as the ocean gets a little bit higher, it's bringing more and more tidal water onto the marsh and onto the wetland platform. And that brings with it sediment, it brings with it nutrients, and it causes the plants to grow bigger and stronger. And as the plants grow bigger and stronger, they make more roots, they make more leaves that then get deposited on the marsh, and they build it up faster. So there's some great studies showing that in many regions, we are actually keeping pace, that's what they call it, keeping pace with sea level, because the marsh simply increases its elevation to stay where it's at and maintain its health through this process of building soil and storing carbon. So these types of responses, again, you need a low disturbance coastline where it's fairly natural. It needs to be pretty high in nutrients because nutrients are fueling that plant growth. So in this case, nutrients are good to some extent. Sediment helps to build it up. And then oftentimes this happens more easily in systems that have large tide ranges that can bring that tidal water up onto the marsh platform. And in the scientific literature, there's a lot of research showing that at current sea level rates in these kind of low disturbance systems that they are building up and keeping pace with sea level with a little bit of a lag time in there. And then of course the third potential response, and this is the one that nobody wants, is submergence. This is when the wetland is just overcome and it starts to slowly convert into an open water system. And this image that I have here is from coastal Louisiana. And I've done a lot of research in Louisiana looking at this very quick rate of wetland submergence. This is a high disturbance system. So in coastal Louisiana, they're experiencing subsidence, which is the soils from the old delta compacting and moving downward, in addition to sea levels moving upward. Their relative sea level rise rates there are about 10 centimeters a year. They're really high. So we've seen marshes actually disappear during the course of our studies, which are only a year or two long. So again, high disturbance areas, if they're adjacent to development, they have no room to move. Micro-tidal systems that don't have a lot of tides and not a lot of sediment to deposit are more likely to experience submergence. And in this case, you know, they're just converting into open water bays. And then the big question there, and what has been the topic of a lot of my research, is what happens to the carbon when it goes underwater? And we're finding a lot of it gets recirculated and decomposed by those microbes in the water.
It's amazing when you think about the resiliency of nature. And I just think about, you know, I think we talked about this the other day, Chambers, is just how if we just allow nature to exist and remain undisturbed, it really can not only survive and adapt, but also can continue to provide those critical ecosystem services for humans, which I think is important.
It's really neat. And if you look at the scientific literature and you look at these naturally occurring feedback mechanisms where, you know, vertical accretion and things like that, we don't have to do anything. It's literally one of those things where humans need to just hands off, step back, and under that kind of undisturbed scenario, the systems find a way to persist.
Dr. Chambers, sorry, there's so much, it's a little noise out here. Again, I just want to echo this concept of marsh migration. It's come up over and over in other places. I feel like that's where everyone's sort of focusing themselves, is allowing the capacity for our wetlands to be able to move inward. But if we could just allow them the time for, number 2 here, the vertical accretion, then we could actually maybe, potentially try to, protect and grow our land instead of losing it and ending up in number 3. So this has definitely been really enlightening for me, just to learn more about that and how wetlands work. But I do want to find out, here in the state of Florida, where we've already done so much work to ditch and drain and remove wetlands and make canals and make those changes. So how has this activity led to some of the flooding impacts that we are sort of seeing right here in the state right now?
Yeah, so the key thing about wetlands is this idea that in order for that organic matter that's accumulated to remain there, it has to stay wet, right? And so if you go back to that other slide I sent you, this is one of my favorite images ever. So this is a really neat place. This is located in what's called the Everglades agricultural area, which is just south of Lake Okeechobee. And historically, it was a giant wetland, the kind of northern parts of the Everglades watershed. And it was one of the areas that was targeted by early Florida settlers as a prime area for agriculture. They saw those organic, rich soils, just like we go and buy in the hardware store, that peat that's full of nutrients and holds water so well. And they wanted to farm it naturally. And so a little bit too much water, they started draining it so they could grow their crops more easily. And some forward-thinking soil scientists from the University of Florida back in the day were interested in what this was going to do to the land and the organic matter and stuff that had built up there. And so in 1924, this group of soil scientists went in and they pounded this 9-foot-long post all the way down to the limestone bedrock. And you can see it here in these images. And when they put it in 1924, the top of the post was flush with the soil surface. And so what you're seeing here is what we call soil oxidation or subsidence, this idea of the soil literally going up in the air. The microbes are respiring it. As soon as the oxygen becomes available when the water level drops, the microbes are able to start respiring, start decomposing things, and they use all of that organic matter and all that plant material as a food source and turn it back into CO2, release it back into the atmosphere where it started. And so you can see here in this one image, a famous old soil scientist in 1986, you can see how much soil had been lost. And then this is a picture of me, I think it was taken in 2012, when I got to go visit this, and as a soil scientist, it was like one of the best experiences of my life, get to stand next to the subsidence pole and get my picture. But you can see now it's over 6 feet of soil that's been lost, and it's just phenomenal. So then in this third image here is a home that's been in this area for a long time. It was built in the early mid 1900s, and it used to be on the soil surface, like it used to be ground level. And as the soil disappeared, they now have to climb upstairs to get to their front door. And then if you see this little tank here, this is actually their septic system that is now sitting, originally was underground, is now sitting on the soil surface because all of that land is gone. And, this is a major issue we see in a lot of areas. Louisiana is another great example here where the city of New Orleans, everyone always says, well, why did they build that there when it's so flood prone? Well, back in the day, there was 60 miles of wetlands between the city of New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. But through channelization of the Mississippi River, hydrologic modifications, all of those wetlands have submerged, they've gone underwater, they've been oxidized, whatever it is, but that land is now gone. And it leaves people and human development really vulnerable. And so it's very important in all of these systems to make sure that we don't modify the hydrology to an extent that our wetlands dry out.
A question for you real quick, Dr. Chambers, that just is fascinating to me. So how big is that land area that's actually subsided to that extent?
In the Everglades agricultural area?
Yes.
I couldn't tell you exactly, but we're talking miles and miles, square miles, pretty much the entire southern portion of Lake Okeechobee. If you look at an aerial image of Lake Okeechobee, you can see just under it all of these colored geometric shapes, and those are the farm fields. That whole area that goes all the way down to Water Conservation Area 2 and everything, what we know as the Everglades, it's all agriculture, and it's all seen just massive subsidence.
Wow, and it's still subsiding?
It is, it's slowing down a little bit now. Kind of interesting. Many of the farms now have no peat left. They're pretty much down to bedrock and limestone. And so a lot of the controversy, it's been a couple of years since then, but a lot of the controversy about the state of Florida buying up sugar land and different things like that. A lot of the reason that the sugar farmers want to get rid of it is because there's no soil left. In a matter of 5 or 10 years, they won't be able to farm it anyway. So they might as well sell it to the state for high price so that they can use it for Everglades restoration. But the farmland, it's simply disappearing. There's no soil left.
Wow, that's amazing.
You know, so we talked about, ditching and draining wetlands, which we know that we've done a lot in the state of Florida. But the other thing that we do a lot now that we have, more policies that protect our wetlands is we allow development immediately adjacent to a wetland. And that's meant to be, no impact, no harm. But what happens when we allow, for example, a residential housing unit or some other sort of very structural approach immediately adjacent to a wetland?
Yeah, so we have a lot of strong wetland protection regulations now, but like you said, a lot of times they delineate that boundary that they say, this is wetland and this is upland, and they don't create any what we call buffer zone in between where development's allowed to occur and where the wetland is. And this is a major issue because what we see is that a lot of times, even though the wetland itself wasn't impacted, there was no machinery or anything in the wetland, we have to think about what a wetland is. And a wetland is a low-lying area within the landscape where water and nutrients flow down and accumulate and are stored for a period of time before they're released downstream. It's kind of our flood protection, right? Well, when you build right up to the edge of a wetland, especially with, normal impervious structures, you're cutting off the entire watershed that's feeding that wetland. And so water is no longer entering the wetland. And oftentimes, normal best management practices for building are that you put in curbs and you connect it to the sewage system. So you're not even getting overland flow through those impervious surfaces into the wetland. You're just simply getting nothing. And so it cuts off the entire watershed, the entire water source to that wetland. And we see this a lot, and then the wetlands, they just don't have enough water. They get drier and drier and drier until they eventually kind of become more upland type of communities. So they no longer serve their function.
This is important. At St. John's Riverkeeper, we talk about the need for buffers all the time, but I think what communities are seeing more and more now is that they're being flooded. And they're being flooded because we've diverted water away from our wetland systems, but even I know you mentioned small areas that serve as depressions, right? Water just used to have spaces that it could go to settle and then to infiltrate. Mm-hmm. And with the abundance of impervious surfaces, the water now is looking for new places to go. When we direct it into our waterways, what we see is that we now have these major, rushes of water that comes in from storms, whether it's stormwater or, even small storms can make our waterways become you know, vessels of floods. And so anyone that has property along a waterway, you might be miles from where that wetland, you know, was previously, that was maybe taking in all of that water, but you're now receiving significant downstream impacts. You're receiving flooding and you've never had flooding before. And I feel like this comes up every day. The Department of Public Works in every county in our watershed, I'm sure, has a call every day saying, I've lived in my home for 50 years and I've never been flooded before and I'm being flooded now. And so, you know, having this conversation about wetlands is just so, I think, critical and connected to all of these other issues that we're working with. But understanding that, what you just brought up, I think is, you know, really key to kind of putting all these pieces together. We've lost a lot of wetlands in our state. Can we create more wetlands? How does that work? And how do you see that as a role for solutions for rising waters?
Yeah, so again, you know, this country has come a long, long way in wetland protection and the no net loss policy that whenever you impact a wetland, you have to recreate at least an equivalent amount, if not more. But there's a multitude of scientific research that shows essentially that the created wetlands, they don't serve the same functions as a natural wetland. And intuitively, this makes sense, right? Nature put a wetland in a certain place in a certain way because that's how it functioned. For a human to come in and decide to put one there artificially, it's just never quite going to be the same. And we've seen through, you know, numerous publications that although, you know, acreage wise, we may even be increasing in our wetland coverage, the quality of those wetlands is very different and the function that they serve in the landscape is very different. A naturally occurring wetland occurs there because it's a natural depression and water tends to accumulate there. If we get rid of that one and put it in another place that it didn't previously occur, that's not where water used to accumulate, right? And so what we see is that, you know, they don't serve the same flood control function that they did before. And then even the other types of functions we talked about, like carbon storage, the most common issue we see with constructed wetlands and created wetlands is that they don't quite get the topography right. And so the hydrology is not correct either. Most commonly, they are dug too deep. So they turn into more like ponds rather than wetlands. So they're not supporting the plant growth that we're used to seeing. And then the whole function about carbon storage, this is a function that takes hundreds of thousands of years to develop. You know, just to put into perspective, some of the soil cores that we've collected just on UCF's campus, there's a bunch of wetlands on UCF, and there's one that it's just one of my favorites. We call it the Bayhead Swamp, and we have cored down 5 meters and gotten just pure organic matter peat all the way down 5 meters. And so if you estimate, for example, that organic matter builds up over time at a rate of, let's say, 1 millimeter per year, and that's kind of conservative. That means at the bottom of that, that's 5,000 years old. You know, 5,000-year-old peat in the bottom of that wetland. That's not something that we can recreate in the matter of a couple years, you know, 4-year monitoring program for a created wetland. It just doesn't replace the value. And so, you know, although I think that the effort is important and noble in some ways, there's a lot of things that need to be changed in order to figure out, you know, are we really replacing the values that we're losing with created wetlands?
I think that's a great point because, you know, so often it feels like wetlands and the impacts to wetlands, it's kind of it's a mathematical exercise where we figure out how many acres do we need to recreate to enhance. And then, you know, each year the Water Management District, for instance, St. Johns River Water Management District, they'll say, look, we actually have a net increase in wetlands now. So look at the great job we're doing. But like you said, I think it's those ecosystem services that take so much time. Over time, they perform more effectively. And that's what we have a hard time measuring sometimes. There's a study, Dr. Chambers, that was done by University of North Florida and some other partners back in 2015 of the St. Johns River. I found this to be so interesting because they were able to quantify some of the benefits of protecting wetlands. And in this study, they found that St. John's River wetlands alone result in almost $3 billion in savings for flood protection, or $15,000 for each resident within the flood zone. And another benefit was the wetlands provided economic value for nutrient removal that exceeded $400 million a year for nitrogen and $5.3 million a year for phosphorus. And so those are services that we are going to have to provide in some way through engineered solutions if we don't protect these natural systems.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting study and a very good point.
So we know that creating wetlands is something that's, I mean, obviously we should continue to do, but we've learned from you today that when it comes to carbon storage, it's really not apples to apples, even though in creating wetlands, they try and make it acres to acreage, right, to have no net loss. But for again, the ecosystem services of our natural wetlands is really not matched in creating wetlands. But what about, and this is just, again, thinking about the state of Florida, we have retention ponds and detention ponds, stormwater ponds, right? All very similar things, but they serve slightly different purposes. They might be constructed to different engineering specifications. But can our retention ponds, and especially abundance of retention ponds in the state of Florida, can they serve the wetland functions that we're looking to have added to help us with our flooding issues in the state?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And you can talk to my students. I kind of rave about this all the time. So I feel like retention and detention basins are such kind of a lost, potentially so valuable resource, right? So we're taking our impervious surfaces, we're digging these large kind of pond-like structures with the purpose of decreasing the quantity of water that's being discharged into the local waterways, right? So we hold it for a period of time and then release it a little bit more slowly so that you don't have as many floods and erosion and stuff downstream. What a fantastic location to not just get rid of and fix water quantity issues, but also to improve water quality, right? So if we designed our retention basins just a little bit differently, they could function like what we call treatment wetlands. So there's many wetlands that are actually purposefully engineered to treat polluted water and remove pollutants. I work in one regularly called the Orlando Wetlands Park, if you're familiar with it, in Christmas, Florida. Huge, incredible system, but humans have realized that there's many things, and one of them is nutrient removal, that natural systems can actually do better than our engineered systems. So engineered systems are really good at removing sediments and things like that. But in terms of getting out nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, the things that cause algal blooms in our coastal regions, conventional wastewater treatment is not very good at it. And so we've designed things like treatment wetlands purposefully to improve water quality. And we could use those same strategies in our retention basins to still serve that purpose of moderating the quantity of water, but also improve it through the process. We could have plants that grow into the retention basins so that we could take up a lot of those nutrients, promote that cycling, promote carbon storage, all of these great functions that wetlands serve, in addition to just holding out and holding water like our current systems do.
And I just actually, Dr. Chambers added in the chat room, if anybody's interested, a link to the Orlando Wetland Park, which is a great place to visit too. If you're a birder or something like that, it's a great place to visit, and you can kind of see what they look like in practice. And also in Ocala, they just actually opened a new wetland treatment park in Ocala as well. That's just recently opened, and so you can visit that as well. There's a link to both of those parks.
Yeah, and I have to give just like a final plug to your students. I feel like the growth of water treatment lands, the need to have more water treatment lands and properties, the amount of, you know, water storage facilities, the need for more land managers to help with HOAs that have stormwater ponds that they wish would be managed more like a natural wetland. These are such incredible avenues for, again, this webcast is all about solutions, right? So solutions to rising waters, really rethinking how we're handling flooding in our state and how we can have multiple benefits, right? This isn't just about a flood storage solution, but about capturing carbon, really trying to mitigate against climate change and doing all that we can for that work. So I just see wetlands as being such a silver bullet. There are no such things, right, as silver bullets, but it's such a silver bullet for what we're talking about. And I feel like you brought up so many points today that really aren't being discussed at that policy level, but could be. And so I hope that we're able to help this message sort of get into higher places, but also that your students are encouraged that they're studying the right things and they're on the right track for where Florida really needs to go in a lot of these conversations with wetlands.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll say too, Shannon, real quick, you know, just for some of you I know have been have watched these river rising programs before, and that we've talked a lot about green infrastructure. And when we talk about green infrastructure, we're talking about using nature-based solutions to managing and treating stormwater and floodwaters. And so we've talked also a lot about engineered green infrastructure solutions, creating bioswales, green roofs, things like that. But I think what we've seen through Dr. Chambers, your work, and the importance of retaining and protecting those natural systems, the green infrastructure that already exists, that we don't have to try to recreate, because even when we recreate it, it's not going to work as well and provide the level of ecosystem services that a natural system would. So I think this is really important, that highlights that. And we all know the importance of wetlands, but I think now hopefully we really understand that they're even more important than we once thought because of the carbon storage capacity of wetlands and what they can do for us. So thank you for your research. We appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we have a few minutes left, and I know we have a few people here on the line. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask Dr. Chambers a question?
And don't be intimidated, y'all. I know when we were getting ready to talk to Dr. Chambers about this, Shannon and I, as non-scientists, were like, gosh, I hope we ask good, smart questions and don't get ourselves, don't show display our ignorance. But any questions you have would, don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to hear your questions.
Well, for anyone, if you still want to speak up, feel free to either raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask, or utilize the chat window. We'll pass out Dr. Chambers' email so that you can all stay in touch. I want to use this chance though, and unless anyone speaks up, to plug our next episode. Join us on October 21st at 4 p.m. We're going to be joined by John Kiefer, who is a principal water resources engineer with Wood Inc. He's going to talk about how our smaller tributaries and their capacity as a solution to rising waters, specifically how our smaller waterways have been altered, left polluted, and degraded after decades of development. We can restore these tributaries, connect them to wetlands, so great segue to this, connect their shorelines, replant trees lost to parking lots and roads, and do all of this work, and that serves as a solution to rising waters as well. So join us on October 21st for that. And with no—
Let me say too, real quick, Shannon, that Dr. Kiefer, if any of you are from Jacksonville or familiar with the Emerald Trail that's being developed in Jacksonville, the restoration of McCoy's Creek and eventually Hogan's Creek, Dr. Kiefer has been instrumental in the restoration of those creeks, the plan that's been put in place. And it's fascinating to hear some of the work he's done on both of those creeks in Jacksonville, and of course what he's done in other restoration projects around the world. Shannon, I'm going to leave everybody.
Sarah, got one question. Sarah,
Okay.
if you want to go ahead, I unmuted you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Dr. Chambers, I put a question in the survey, and I was just kind of curious about how ecosystem services provided by wetlands, especially coastal wetlands, will change with sea level rise from what they currently are providing to what they will provide in the future.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks for the question. So as sea level rises, a lot of different processes change within coastal wetlands. We've done a lot of research in our lab that looks kind of at the kind of nitty-gritty details about how salinity in particular, the salt concentration in the ocean, changes the way that wetlands function. In some ways it can actually be beneficial, in other ways it's harmful. But for the most part, all coastal wetlands serve really important functions. What we typically see is that the more saline types of wetlands are really good at moderating storm surge and serving these types of sedimentation functions and nursery habitats. And then as we move further inland, we get more of that carbon storage type of ecosystem services, maybe more of the nutrient removal types of services. So it's really important that we keep the variety of coastal wetland habitats there, where we have both the saline, the brackish, and the freshwater marshes in that whole spectrum along the coastal zone. And that we're able to let those systems respond to sea level by either that marsh migration inland or vertical accretion to keep that area there to provide those services.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And
Yeah, thanks.
And thanks everyone for joining in and participating today, especially you, Dr. Chambers, for taking your time and expertise to join us. Again, join us in 2 weeks on October 21st, and check out our website to find this recording and other recordings from previous conversations about solutions to rising waters. Have a great day, everyone.
I'm going to leave y'all with one fact that I heard, Dr. Chambers. I thought this was interesting. And the Natural Resource Defense Council, on their website, they said the estimated total carbon storage of wetlands globally is 225 billion metric tons, or the equivalent of carbon emissions from roughly 189 million cars every year.
Wow.
That's actually more cars. Not talking about trucks, but that's more cars that were actually registered in the United States in 2018. So I think that's pretty amazing. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we're trying to protect wetlands throughout the state of Florida.
Great. Yes, definitely.
Thank you again.